Well, again, thanks very much. What I was going to do this morning, as Mike said, was give you kind of a real-time update. If you even were on Cap to Cap, we've had things that have developed since then. But for those of you, and you may hear a little bit of this in repeat, but for those of you that weren't on Cap to Cap, give you a little bit of an overview of what's happening in D.C. on the Hill on the transportation reauthorization bill. There are two main substantive proposals that have been put forward, one from the administration and one literally about an hour ago, which is marked up by the Senate Environment Public Works Committee. So I'm going to contrast and sort of give you a little bit of a side-by-side, if you will, of the administration bill and the Senate bill as it is evolving. And I want to really emphasize the evolving piece here. I think you know a little bit about who we are. As Mike said, we are trying to put together an alliance of local leaders, cities, regions, business voices. Mike was back for our new advisory board that we kicked off this week, where we're very thrilled to have good business representation from around the country as we grow our alliance. Here's a little bit of where things stand. The federal transportation bill is important because it is a funding bill. It is not really a regulatory bill. It's the bill that divvies up all the money that gets paid in by the 18.4 cent a gallon gasoline tax. That bill was last done in 2012 by Congress and signed by the President. It was a 2-year bill. Very short as these things go because they didn't have enough money to do a longer bill. And so it expires October the 1st, and when I talk about the administration's proposal, the Senate proposal, these are the proposals to basically replace this existing law that expires in October the 1st. But in addition to the bill expiring, the trust fund, transportation is somewhat unique at the federal level because it is not a general appropriation, it is a trust-funded program. There are not a lot of those. It basically walls off revenues when times were good and the gasoline tax was generating more revenue than we spent. Of course, it was great to have a trust fund. So with a couple of exceptions, it didn't get rated. Now the problem is we're actually obligating to the states more than the gasoline tax is bringing in. So now we are in deficit, and the feds have basically transferred general fund money over to the highway trust fund. If Congress does nothing, the trust fund will go broke at the end of August. We will go into a zero balance. But that's not actually the critical time. When we go below a $4 billion, I know it sounds like a lot of money, you spread it around the country for major infrastructure projects. It's not. We go below a $4 billion balance at the federal level in the trust fund, and USDOT basically begins to slow up payments and reimbursements. That point in time is estimated to be about somewhere in mid-July. Now, work backwards from there, and I'm curious if any of you at the local level or at Caltrans have any updates on this. There are several states that are actually looking at slowing down contracts or not even letting contracts because the uncertainty in what Congress will do. So we have a money problem, which is the trust fund, and then we have a sort of a policy requirement to reauthorize the bill. Those two things are, it's a little gray, they are linked, but they are actually on somewhat separate tracks. What Senator Boxer is doing by advancing a bill this morning through her committee is basically saying, I have jurisdiction over the policy, I'm going to write a bill, I'm going to put it out there, it's 6 years. Her committee doesn't pay for the bill. The bill is actually paid for in the Senate Finance Committee. So she's basically putting the pressure on other Senate leaders to say, you've got to figure out sort of where we're going to get the money for this. We'll get into more of this in detail, but again, two big pieces, the money piece with the trust fund, the policy piece with MAP 21, both are really important. As I mentioned, the administration released its Grow America Act last month. EPW committee marking up their bill this morning. It's out of committee now. And next, the Banking and Commerce Committee have to act. In the Senate, the jurisdiction is split on policy. So the Banking Committee actually authorizes the mass transit title. The Commerce Committee actually authorizes the passenger rail safety and freight, interstate commerce portions of the bill, and the Environment Public Works Committee does what is called the highway title, but actually within that highway title there are air quality provisions, there are bicycle pedestrian provisions, there's a lot of, there's NPO provisions, so there's a lot of important stuff that was done this morning. As I said, the Senate Finance Committee still needs to act on the money side, And then on the House, it's a different ballgame. They have not moved as quickly as the Senate. It is unclear if they are going to try to mark up a bill this year. And while all of this is very important, and not to make you not pay attention for the rest of the presentation, but the prevailing wisdom is, and this may not surprise you, we believe that Congress will basically get about a 6-month sort of patch to the trust fund and push this off past the midterm elections. Now, I said that, and we were here 2 years ago in 2012 thinking they'll never pass a transportation bill, and they did. So don't count them out. This is still important. Our alliance has about a 5-principle platform: investment, innovation, local control, options and multimodal approach, and access to jobs. I have copies of our platform for reauthorization up here if you'd like a copy. Again, I'm going to give you this morning mostly a Senate versus administration comparison. This is an important slide because it basically tells you the history of this program. As I said, when times were good and flush, not only was this a popular bill, this is the bill that we had lots of earmarks in. If you remember, you may even know some earmarks. It got very controversial in 2005 when SAFE-T was passed. That was the old bridge to nowhere, if you remember that. And everybody said, what's happened to this bill? We shouldn't have these earmarks. And in MAP 21 2 years ago, no more earmarks. So that's another thing that has actually really changed the dynamic on Capitol Hill, regardless of how you feel about earmarks from a public policy perspective. They are a bit of what made this bill work in terms of getting it through a massive Congress with lots of different opinions. There are no more earmarks. And in many ways, we took 2.5 years to debate MAP 21, and that was seen as part of the reason. Also notice that in MAP 21, that's not, roughly we basically held even funding. After we went up on an annual basis over the years, roughly every 5 or 6 years, from 91 to 98 to 2005, we held flat. Okay, that gets right back to the issue of the trust fund. And again, as I mentioned, here's the balance sheet for the Federal Highway Trust Fund, and the mass transit account is nested within this Highway Trust Fund, so it really is at least highways and transit. You can see that balance going negative there again sometime between July and August. We also, in addition to our policy proposal, we and many others have put forward proposals for revenue increases. We have not actually picked a favorite, if you will. We have proposed a menu of revenue ideas. There are lots of ideas on the table. I know Mike mentioned in terms of maybe some of the more creative ones. We have proposed a gasoline tax increase, which is typically how the program is funded, as I said. There have been proposals by Senator Boxer herself to even swap the gas tax for a sales tax, a % sales tax, which would actually then grow, of course, with the increase in the cost of gasoline, a per barrel oil fee. And I'll get into more in terms of the administration and the Senate in terms of where we think those proposals are heading. Okay, so I hope you can see this. I'm just going to give you now a very high level, sort of issue by issue, how these things compare. And I'll give you at least the revenue side with our proposal next to it. The administration, as I said a couple of weeks ago, put out its proposal for a transportation authorization bill. This was a really big deal, very important. Administrations don't often put forward a lot of their own draft legislative language. This administration in particular has made it a little bit of their strategy actually not to put forward specifics. They are known for not putting, but sort of working with Congress and letting things play out on the Hill. In fact, in the run-up to MAP 21 in 2011, many of us were hoping the administration would put forward its own proposal. They did not. I will tell you the new Secretary, Anthony Fox, I think has a very different perspective on this. And the fact that the administration released their own bill, Grow America, that's in the left-hand column there, and you'll see this throughout, is in part, I understand, a testament to really his doggedness and belief that the administration has to be more proactive. You may have seen the president yesterday standing in front of the Tappan Zee Bridge in New York. These are good signs. These are good signs that the White House is going to get engaged and talk about this. The Grow America Act on funding, as you might be able to tell as well, is pretty ambitious. $75 billion a year versus basically the Senate proposal right now, which is sort of flat plus inflation around 55, a little bit more, versus our proposal is kind of somewhere in the middle there. The administration has proposed corporate tax reform as the way to fill the gap. Now, that actually has some legs on, by a few members on Capitol Hill in terms of either tax reform or the issue of repatriating offshore profits. You may ask yourself, well, why is this related to transportation? It is not. This, I think, it really is a testament to how politically difficult it is to talk about things like a gasoline tax increase. The president himself has said, I'm not raising any taxes on the middle class, including the gasoline tax. So how are you going to fill that hole? One of the weaker points of the administration's proposal was there were no details on this corporate tax reform. It was sort of, we'll do corporate tax reform, we'll close loopholes, and we'll use $100+ billion to basically fill the gap. Interestingly, the House Ways and Means Chairman, Dave Camp, has proposed something quite similar in terms of corporate tax reform. So far, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the Senate in the middle there, and it is not Barbara Boxer's, Senator Boxer's, again, jurisdiction to figure out the funding, but the Senate has not come forward with a proposal. The Senate Finance Committee is chaired by Senator Wyden from Oregon, and the ranking member is Senator Hatch from Utah. So, again, that question is on the table in the next few months. Either they're going to have to figure out a way to fund the transportation bill, or, as I said, come up with some sort of a short-term patch to get perhaps through the end of the calendar year. So, a couple of themes I want to pass through. Please ask questions, any clarifying questions as we go. I'd like to get your thoughts, your questions to sort of understand what I'm going to cover. Understand that, as I said, this is a work in progress. In fact, this morning during the Senate EPW committee markup, there were a whole block of amendments offered and accepted into the bill. So I'm going to give you information as I knew it a couple of days ago. This is changing on a week-by-week basis. Also understand that both the administration bill and the Senate bill still have sort of a lot of gaps in them. There are places where they have not been specific for a reason. So this is how legislation gets put together, as much as I know it is done here in California or maybe at your jurisdiction. So some of these things we're not going to be able to give you specifics on. Well, let's talk about freight first. I know a big issue for California, a big issue for this region and the state north to south. We believe that freight is a really important issue. We believe that we need a pretty smart approach to how we get freight unstuck, where we target those investments. This is just a little graphic to show you that a ton of freight takes almost as long to get from LA to Chicago as it does to cross the city of Chicago. We've got some real bottlenecks and choke points, and I think the question again for us is any approach coming out of the federal level going to actually target in a smart way investments to unclogging that freight? And so we will see. Let's see if I can move this. Okay. So here's the. I'm going to give you just the side-by-sides for the administration bill, Grow America, the Senate bill on the right-hand side. Again, remember, Grow America is a much larger bill with a much larger increase in funding, even though it isn't got a lot of specifics about how we get there. So as you'll see, some of these price tags are going to be higher on the administration side. We do not currently have a freight program at the federal level, just to be really clear. This is not an issue that has been addressed. We have given states kind of transportation funds and sort of hope that they have addressed freight along with a lot of other issues like safety and congestion. So this is a big change. It's a big change for the administration and for the Congress to say there shall be targeted funding specifically for freight. On the left-hand side, the administration's bill, $2.5 billion a year. That is a sizable program. It is all modes of transportation. It is discretionary, i.e., it is a competitive grant program at the national level. I know perhaps the local level that might make you feel, boy, I don't have much of a chance to compete. But I do think if we get good performance measures and a cost-benefit analysis applied to those investments, that gets back to the previous slide I mentioned, which is I think we have a good shot at actually maybe making a difference in some of these bottlenecks. Interestingly and importantly, and I'm going to give you this analysis as we go, all levels of government are eligible for the administration's freight program. If you see on the right-hand side there, the Senate program, it's only state departments of transportation that are eligible to apply. Obviously important that states are eligible, but we think there are other entities that also are key to have in there. The administration's program takes a pretty interesting approach as well. They have an incentive program for half of those funds for freight planning. In fact, there are many sort of things they ask states and regions to do in terms of developing freight plans and having strategic approaches. And then you have to sort of accomplish those tasks to opt in to half of that fund. And then the other half is a capital discretionary grant program for freight projects, multimodal, all levels of government. On the Senate side, the bill this morning that was passed, $1 billion a year for freight, so smaller, also starts very small and grows over time. So we've actually got a shorter bill in the Senate. You'll actually lop off some of that freight funding. It is a highway-only program, and it is not discretionary. It basically spreads the money around by formula to states. I think it's based on their current allocation for the highway funds, the NHPP program. But again, something that I think we would have concerns in terms of that formula program, that every state's basically getting a prorated share, rather than say, boy, we've got a big problem at this port. Let's really invest and try to fix that. And again, only states eligible to apply. So a pretty different approach, even though both proposals have freight in them. Talk a little bit about discretionary grant programs and some innovative programs. I think you all know the Tiger program from USDOT. This is a map showing all the grants over the first 5 cycles, I believe. We're fans of this program and this approach. In fact, we just brought on board to our team Beth Osborne, who was the former Assistant Secretary for the USDOT and oversaw this program. Let's see how both proposals address this. Obviously, because this really came from the administration, their proposal, Grow America, has a pretty substantial increase in the Tiger program. They propose $1.25 billion a year. Right now, Tiger's funded about $600 million a year, between $500 and $600 every year. That actually comes out of the Appropriations Committee. Tiger is actually not in the federal transportation bill. It came out of the stimulus package. And the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, especially the Senator Patty Murray, is a big fan of this program, of course, because she's got a pretty big port there in the Port of Seattle. Eligible applicants on the administration proposal include all levels of government. On the Senate side, they didn't call it Tiger. In fact, they have tried to get at a program that has been on the books now for several years, but has never been adequately funded, has either been earmarked or just not funded. And that is what's called PNRS, or Projects of National and Regional Significance. You see $400 million a year there in terms of the Senate's proposal versus 1.25. Interestingly, they made this program come out of the trust fund. Remember I mentioned the trust fund earlier? This never came out of the trust fund. It came out of the general fund. They relied on appropriations to fund this program. It never happened. And so they've actually swapped this program, PNRS, and they have kicked out transportation research. I don't know if you touch the research money at all, but we think that actually is some pretty important money in terms of bringing innovations and technology to market. That has now gone into the general fund, and they have brought PNRS over to the trust fund. The other issue with PNRS in our minds is the project cost threshold, and that is, and this is interesting, and I think it is one time where an example of where at the federal level we are still feeling our way in terms of what makes a nationally significant project, okay? I mentioned earlier we've got real problems at ports and waterways, inland ports, freight bottlenecks, metropolitan congestion. We need, a very targeted approach on those investments. The project cost threshold here means that if your project that you want to apply for under this Senate program is less than $350 million, you cannot apply. So in this case, the federal government has said it's only really the large, expensive projects that are in the national interest, and we would beg to differ. Isn't it actually the case that if you had a smaller, more cost-effective project that has a bigger bang for the buck, you should be eligible? So there was an amendment offered this morning by Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island that actually lowered that project cost threshold. I don't know yet what that was lowered to. I don't think it was significant. But it lowered it basically to say, look, it is not about actually how big or expensive your project is. It's about how effective it is. So let's not judge it by how much money it costs, but by its kind of bang for the buck. Again, something I think that makes a bit of sense. On the Senate side, again, all levels of government eligible for that program. A couple of interesting approaches, again, things that are not currently actually on the books anywhere, but that have been proposed for a while by the administration and now have been mirrored in the Senate. You may be familiar, and I'm sure this is a source of either debate or disagreement, but the Race to the Top program, the education program, where basically the administration says, look, here's a bunch of money, we want you to do 10 of these things on education reform, and if you do those things, you then become eligible for a discretionary competitive pot. However you feel about that, and believe me, I've got kids in public elementary school, so I'm not sure about education reform, I'm really mixed on it. But I like this idea of actually having some competition around innovation. And on the administration side, the left-hand side here, they've got a proposal in their bill called the FAST program. It's funded pretty significantly at $1 billion a year. You basically have to, it isn't so much actually a race to the top where you have to accomplish certain things to get in, as much as it has been in previous years in their proposals. But it really is for sort of these innovative ideas that really are sort of cutting edge and move the needle. It's a whole laundry list, and I will say, again, this is one of these places where it's a little bit vague. But interestingly in here, and I will really point this out because we are very interested and concerned about how much MPOs, metropolitan regions, local governments get access to these funds. They've set aside a quarter of the FAST money for basically what's called a metropolitan mobility program. Now, we've seen this proposal before in different versions of the bill the last few years. So 25% of this money is set aside for high-performing MPOs. You may well ask, well, what is a high-performing MPO? Or are we a high-performing MPO? And I would say, again, this is somewhere where the administration has been vague. They've talked about performance-based planning. They've talked about an equitable allocation of resources. But again, I would say that this idea of actually setting a bar and saying, look, you've got to do certain things to be able to be eligible for some of this money is a good idea, and we'll have to see how this plays out in specifics. States, tribes, MPOs eligible for this. On the Senate side, interestingly, a little bit of a mirror of this program. They've called it the American Transportation Awards Program. Once again, not a lot of specifics about what this is. Much less money, $125 million. General funded, not trust funded, so very unclear and uncertain that that money will actually materialize. But I would say an important recognition that something like this might occur. And if you've heard my prior presentations, either I've been here or in DC, I mean, from our perspective as T4, one of our key messages to lots of local communities like yourselves is the more you innovate, the more you raise your own money, the more you go to the ballot, the more you do cutting edge things, we believe, the better you will do in the future. Whether it's this program, whether it's a TIFIA loan program, I do think we are in a more competitive environment these days. We used to get money by formula. We were sort of guaranteed money coming to the states. That will still happen, but we are seeing more and more of these kinds of approaches. So I personally think you all are doing great work in this region. I think you are cutting edge for many of your activities, like the blueprint planning process you've undertaken. That bodes really well for a region like Sacramento. And it should in these kinds of programs. We want other folks to do something similar. There's been a lot of talk and interest in the sort of the active transportation, bicycle pedestrian provisions. Interestingly, Grow America, the administration's bill, didn't do much on this from the existing law. They maintained what's called the Transportation Alternatives, or TAP program. They did include a complete streets provision, which you may all be familiar with. On the Senate side, they also included this TAP program. It's about $1 billion a year. Interestingly, and I think to their credit, they increased access from the local level in terms of what we call suballocated money from 1/2 to 2/3. So we now actually have more of this TAP money coming down to regions. When we talk about suballocation and regions having control, just understand that in California, and I used to work at MTC just down the 80 from you, so I know this by experience. We've had a state law in the books here in California for some time that has suballocated money down to regions. So some of this is a little bit on the margins. It's still important. Other states, those regions don't have access to these funds. So it's an even bigger deal for many other states in California. So increased access to this TAP program, about $1 billion a year. There is no complete streets provision in the Senate, although there was an amendment offered this morning. I can tell you there is a lot of interest among senators on active transportation, biking, walking, complete streets. Did not get into the base bill, but an amendment being offered and being suggested, which shows you there's a lot of interest. Also, very interestingly, on the subject of performance measures, which I'm actually not going to cover in detail today, because I could give you a whole presentation on performance measures, which you're going to have to actually do once the US DOT develops rules on national performance measures. The Senate bill actually separates out and has a bicycle walking non-motorized performance measure, which was something in the original MAP 21 that wasn't present, something a lot of folks have sort of asked US DOT to rule on, and now the Senate basically making a stand saying, look, safety is really critical, important. We have a highway safety program, performance measures are important, but actually when you think about safety, thinking about safety for all modes of transportation, so highway safety, local street safety, but also biking and walking safety, because the interventions are sometimes different, and even the data and trends are different. We're actually seeing in-vehicle fatality rates drop, but we're seeing biking and walking fatalities increase. So interesting sort of recognition here by the Senate to do something different. Again, metro areas, MPOs, thought it would be of interest to you all. I'm just really kind of mentioning again the FAST program. I've already given you that sort of set aside for this Metropolitan Mobility Program. Frankly, not much on the Senate side, and this is, again, something I would just flag in both the Senate bill as it moves forward and whatever we see from the House, which is the notion of actually empowering metropolitan regions and trying to solve congestion, mobility in our metropolitan economies. When I say metropolitan, I mean the center, urban, suburban, and rural that surround our major metros. Not much in there right now from the Senate. It'll be a question about whether we see it from the House. And again, something we think is really important to begin to target those funds and to empower more local governments and metro region planning agencies. Loan programs, this has been a big deal in the existing law. The MAP 21 from 2 years ago, one of the biggest changes it made was to increase what we call the TIFIA loan program. It went from $125 million a year to $1 billion a year, a huge increase in TIFIA, one of the major changes in the last bill. Interestingly, both the administration bill and the Senate bill both maintain TIFIA at $1 billion a year, although I believe there was an amendment this morning that may have knocked down the TIFIA program. This is an interesting dynamic in the Senate where we have more rural senators, rural state senators, in this case I believe it was Inhofe from Oklahoma, not really seeing how they can participate. So TIFIA is a loan program. It is not a grant, so you basically come up, you get a loan from them, you've got, like any loan, you've got to pay it back. It has very favorable terms. You get 5 years of deferred repayment. You pay at Treasury rate interest. You might be able to beat that on the market, but it's a pretty good deal. There are lots of other things that also make it very favorable from a multimodal perspective. Los Angeles has made good use of this, and frankly, it was Mayor Villaraigosa's kind of signature achievement in the last bill. Also, very interestingly, if this holds, something that we had advocated for in the Senate bill, the TIFIA program used to be a $50 million project minimum. So remember I said the PNRS was $350, TIFIA is a $50 million loan. Well, there's some small projects, even at 50, that won't qualify. The Senate bill includes a provision passed this morning that lowers that minimum to a $10 million project size, specifically for projects around transit corridors. That's defined broadly, whether that's rail or bus rapid transit, doing actually the placemaking and the infrastructure around transit corridors. We think that's a good idea, frankly, because we can begin to get creative, we hope, leveraging value capture, leveraging private-public partnerships. There are ways that you can pay back, we believe, some of that infrastructure by the increase in value in property, in TIFs, in bids around a transit corridor or station, so that you get that loan up front, you get 5 years to actually build the project, and you pay it back when you have your revenues coming in. As we always say, we don't make you buy your house with cash, so why should we make you pay for this other stuff with cash? If you're smart about this, important to obviously know all the terms and how this works, but we think that's a very, very favorable provision that's in the Senate bill there. On the administration side, interestingly, they did not include that provision, but they did try to address the rural concern for rural areas. And I don't have a lot of information exactly how they did that. I could certainly follow up if you all are interested in loan programs. Let's talk a little bit about passenger rail, since I understand this is an important topic here in California. I'm a big fan of the Capital Corridor service that I just used yesterday. We have never actually funded passenger rail out of the federal transportation program. It comes through Amtrak, it comes through general fund every year. We have to fight that out in appropriations, and it competes against defense and education and social security and everything else. The administration's bill, one of the biggest changes it makes in a very big way is it says it is time for passenger rail, and I'm not just talking about high speed because I know we could talk about that for a while, all passenger rail, a dedicated trust fund for passenger rail for the first time ever from the administration. I can tell you, while passenger rail is certainly a political hot potato around the country, local commuter rail, local Amtrak service is an issue that cuts across party line, it cuts across urban-rural. There is growing and growing desire to get some sort of passenger rail connection, whether it's big cities or frankly a lot of small places we're working with in the South are desperate to bring back a lot of their rail service because they have lost essential air service. And so this they see as that connection again back to some of those major either metro areas or frankly even some of the university hubs. So dedicated funding from the administration. There's a lot of other things that's in that provision for passenger rail. There is a loan program called RIF, which the administration addresses. On the Senate side, to be fair, the EPW committee, Chairman Boxer's committee, does not actually address rail head on. That's the Senate Commerce Committee. Remember I said there's 3 committees, EPW, Commerce, and Banking. So we hope and anticipate that the Commerce Committee will act on a rail title in the next month. But one of the things that, again, on the issue of flexibility, we have been hoping to see out of the Senate EPW committee is some flexibility for some of the highway funds for passenger rail. So if I have a built-out corridor, if there's nothing else I can do on a corridor, shouldn't I be able to actually have a parallel corridor with rail service, commuter rail service, Amtrak service? Right now, you don't have that opportunity, that flexibility under current law. Again, we think you need more tools in the toolbox. That's something we have hoped to see, and we did not see so far in the EPW version of the bill. But again, hopefully the Commerce Committee will address that.
James,
yeah.
Before you move on,
yeah.
That slide. Obviously, there's controversy over California's high-speed rail and some other high-speed rail projects, but you know the definition of high-speed rail can be very broad to include really just modernizing, upgrading what you refer to as Amtrak local. It's not really local. It's just part of the existing rail intercity service.
Right.
So do you see the controversy around high speed being so poisonous that it carries over so that Congress is only going to want to do things that don't really upgrade service, or that there might be interested in upgrading as long as it's not one of these major controversies?
I think people want to upgrade service. I think that it you know, again, you know the deal in Washington. We've become more polarized and unfortunately sort of, you know, press release driven than ever. Having said that, I can really, and there's many other issues I've even addressed in this presentation I don't think have bipartisan support. I think there's bipartisan support for actually upgrading rail service. I really do, and it's being driven from the local level up to members of Congress, and so that it's not going to just get sort of I don't think this will get now. I think the harder thing, of course, is the money issue, because if you don't actually have access to these funds already, and we don't grow the program, that's the problem we have. Is well, you know, we're gonna carve up a pot that's not growing. Again, I would say I think there's a strong argument to be made for flexibility in funding on the highway side. And I want to say a little bit about funding in a second, but again, we've got challenges at the federal level. Don't count Congress out, as I said earlier. It may well be that they kick the can down the road and we get the most likely scenario is we get a 6-month extension. I'm always hesitant to say that, because then I think people put their notes down and their iPads down and say, well, I'll just put a calendar reminder, January 2015, call my member of Congress. That is not what we want. The wheels are in motion to do a bill, both on the House side and the Senate side. And even if the Senate flips over to be Republican in November, whatever gets done right now in the next few months, I believe are going to be the basic framework and architecture of a bill that gets passed next year. So these are very important times. You've got a really important delegation. I've mentioned some of these themes in here about no national rail or freight program, the loss of earmarks. I don't think we'll see the whole mass transit program threatened. It was in 2012. There was a proposal to eliminate all dedicated funding for public transit. Don't think it's going to happen this time again. But we've obviously got a lot of challenges to address. The Senate bill is moving. As I said, it's got to go through banking and commerce. But we are not entirely happy with where it stands and think that it still needs to be changes. And of course, the money issue is everything. And so on that point, I mentioned our revenue proposal in terms of a sort of a menu approach. I think one of the things that I think generated interest on one of the recent trips to Washington from some of you was a proposal that I think actually Representative Garamendi brought up, and this is not going to be new to you, but a vehicle miles traveled fee, right? And I read an article about actually that Senator DeSaulnier here, I think, has something that he wants to put forward. So there is this interesting, I think, moment in time that we're in transportation, which is that we are, A, we're in a crisis, B, that our funding source that we've had, frankly, since the 1920s, since we went off general obligation bonds back in the turn of the 20th century, and we decided a motor fuel tax was the way to go. And interestingly, that was pioneered, A, by the states, and B, by Oregon in particular. Oregon is now, once again, I think, leading the pack and doing a VMT pilot. They have a program up there. I can get you more information on it. It's a voluntary opt-in program. I think it's capped at 5,000 people. And you basically get to not pay your state gasoline tax. And then in exchange for that, you are basically charged a fee per mile you drive. And at the end of the year, you basically give your odometer reading into the state, and you pay basically on what you drove. It's a pilot program. I believe the idea is it's going to go into 2016. They're going to take the results in 2015 and get ready to actually go statewide in 2016. How that looks, whether that's everybody gets to opt out of the gas tax, state gas tax, and get opt into a VMT fee, I think is very unclear. I'm sure you probably know a lot of the concerns around VMT fee. Now, the odometer reading is addressing the concern we've heard a lot, which is privacy issues. I frankly think that concern is going to go away in about 3 or 4 years once people see how much their cell phone data is being used. And frankly, once a new generation of people comes up who is just very used to this stuff. I do not think the Congress is going to act first on a VMT fee. And that's not to say that we should not get out there to be innovative, to push them, to show them what Oregon is doing. Washington has a pilot program, I think a little bit lagging behind Oregon. Obviously it's being talked about here in California, but if you look at the federal gasoline tax history, and past is not always prologue, but in the 1920s the states passed a gasoline tax. 10 years later we put a penny on from the federal level of gasoline tax for deficit reduction, and in 1956, 30 years after the states acted, we finally put in and slid over the gasoline tax for transportation. Congress is not going to stick their necks out on a VMT fee. I'm just trying to give you my reality check. The states, though, should. The states should lead. The states should pilot. The states should innovate. And if enough states do this, I think we've got a chance at getting something, perhaps it's an opt-out of the federal gasoline tax eventually. What that all means is from now in 2014, probably till about 2020, I believe we're going to have a pretty chaotic period in terms of how we fund our infrastructure and transportation in particular. Gasoline tax is going to continue to decline. We might index it. We might raise the federal level. We are trying to build that coalition. But how fast we can index and raise the gasoline tax is also, we have to remember that cars are getting more efficient. Vehicle miles traveled are declining. Hybrids and EVs are coming online. So if you think about just the simple math on that, the gasoline tax can't be here forever as a sustainable, reliable funding source, unless we are willing to raise it to about European standards. And I could be wrong, but I don't think we're willing to do that. So I think the VMT fee is the way to go. I think it is good to talk about it in Congress. I think we need to get in front of the two committees that deal with this are the Senate Finance Committee, chaired by Senator Wyden, And the House Ways and Means Committee chaired by Chairman Camp from Michigan, although he's retiring. I believe we have some California members on both of those committees. But I don't think this is going to be the way we fund transportation at the federal level in the short term. So that's a bit of an update on that. I would love to see California advance some sort of an Oregon-like pilot program for folks to opt out and test this. If we don't test it and we just keep talking about it, it's not going to do much good. And the other thing I would say, especially from a state like California, is if it's going to replace the gas tax, we need to make sure it's flexible, multimodal. There's lots of states and interest groups that are saying, well, it should only go to roads. Roads are important. We need to fix roads. Transit runs on roads. People bike on roads. But it needs to be multimodal and flexible. And I think that's the experience we have here in California. So